Right, so I'll try to highlight not only the diversity of problems which we can address, but also the variety, several hardware platforms from quantum dots to atoms and optical lattices to ions. And I should start by giving credit to people who really did all the work. So like on the theory side, it was, when talking about cold atoms, the project was really driven by Annabelle and Fabian. On sort of ions, this was Dries and Kushal. And also on the quantum dot, this was Yao Wang. And also quite a few interesting ideas have been discussed with John, who is here in the audience. And I guess maybe Kushal is joining virtually. And what made this work particularly rewarding was the opportunity to interact with experimental colleagues. So this is a group of Emanuel Bloch and Markus Greiner for experiments on cold atoms, Levin van der Sijpen group with quantum dots. Also the group of Crystal Noel, who is here and will sort of speak later at this conference, and her collaborators Marco and Chris on ion chains. So, and I'll try to sort of focus on just a few subjects which hopefully will be interesting to the audience here. And as I said, beginning with sort of work on quantum dots, but I will, and then moving to cold atoms and then to ion chains. I'll try to emphasize that what is really interesting is the kind of synergy between the type of experiments which can be done on different platforms and how one can borrow ideas, not only like as a theorist, but as sort of like in terms of solving classes of problems, but also on how to implement different protocols. So, okay, actually, I couldn't resist to start with just reminding of this fairly old experiment by now, which was the first demonstration of exchange interaction in cold atoms in the group of Emanuel Bloch when he was still in Mainz. And that sort of, to me, it's just, well, it's kind of really kind of a local a progress made locally. And the idea was fairly simple, that in a double quantum well, by using the gradient of magnetic field, one can prepare like different spin states and then manipulate it by sort of turning on and off gradient of magnetic field to see spin oscillations. And if we look at how this experiment was implemented, it's actually conceptually very similar to what people have done just a few years ago when they used double quantum dot and in order to demonstrate spin exchange interactions. If you look at the detail of, let's say, how states in this double quantum dot are prepared by starting with two electrons in one quantum well, then splitting them into two and using the same, and then sort of putting electrons back into one well to do the readout, it's essentially the same procedure that has been done for cold atoms, so that to initialize the system to fermions were, to bosons were in the same well, and then for readout, again, they were pushed into the same well. So in that example, in a sense, cold atoms were playing catch-up, so they were sort of redoing experiments that has been previously done in a solid-state system. But recently, we have seen examples of sort of simulation with quantum dots overtaking cold atoms. So, for example, so this specific question is about observing Nagaoka ferromagnetism. Was first addressed in was first discussed theoretically as something that can be done with cold atoms, but it was realized in the group of Levin van der Sijpen in Delft. And maybe for younger people in the audience, it's kind of a fairly simple question. Imagine, I just give you a like very specific version of it, sort of for a plaquette. Imagine that we have 4 sites and we put 3 fermions in there. So what is the lowest energy state? Is it when the spin of the system is 1/2 or when the spin of the system is 3/2? So like we used to anti-ferromagnetic exchange interactions, so naively we would say, oh, look, it's always like a lower spin should be favorable because spins are maximally anti-aligned. However, if we think about kinetic energy of the hole, it's actually optimized when all the spins are pointing the same way. And the reason is that if all the spins are the same, then when the hole, let's say, propagates from this corner to the upper left corner, it can do it on two trajectories. And for them to, if we want to have constructive interference, this should be in distinguishable configuration. That's why parallel spins are favored. Therefore, it's a state. Like this competition is really a competition with an exchange interaction for many fermions versus optimizing kinetic energy for one fermion. And so what is kind of interesting that you can say, well, it's such a simple problem, like theorists have no business even contributing to this experiment. But if you look at actual numbers, they're quite remarkable that if we look at, and if you really start calculating, say, what's a typical Coulomb interaction energy of electrons when they're in a single quantum dot, you find that it's orders of magnitude larger than let's say, the splitting between high spin and low spin state. Therefore, you really have to do multi-band calculations if you want to sort of be confident about results of experiments that we are sort of understanding what are the scales involved. But it's kind of remarkable that results from a single band Hubbard model still work even in such a complicated setting. Okay, and there are other interesting stories for which, okay, I'll be happy if somebody asks, like including like what happens if we change boundary conditions, and something that has been discussed previously theoretically and that has been verified in experiments. Okay, but probably the model of quantum simulation that's most familiar to everybody here is the idea of realizing Fermi Hubbard model using cold atoms in an optical lattice, which so we believe that a lot of essential physics in the loop rates is captured by the Hubbard model, and that's a model which can be realized quite faithfully using cold atoms. So what has been interesting in the last few years is the development of the technique of quantum gas microscopes, which allow to measure all fermions in the system. So what you see here is not kind of a theorist's caricature of a many-body state. It's actually a result of an actual experiment. So this is from Emmanuel Bloch's group. So they really, like in this two-dimensional system, they measured the state of every site, and where you see like a red square, this is where they saw a spin-down fermion. Where you see a blue square, it's a spin-up fermion, and empty sites obviously correspond to having no fermions. So in some kind of humorous way, we can compare, we can think about this as a pointillist picture of a many-body state, just like there was a style of art in Impressionism where instead of using brushstroke, people used individual dots to sort of create beautiful paintings. So therefore, the kind of question that I'll be discussing like during the next few minutes is how we can take this pointillist representation of a many-body state and learn something about the underlying physics. And okay, and let's start with one of the basic but important questions of the interplay of charge and spin in the Fermi Hubbard model. So let us consider the motion of a single dopant in a two-dimensional Fermi Hubbard model. So here we start, it's again, for simplicity, I show like just a classical picture of an antiferromagnetic state. Of course, it has some quantum fluctuations, but it's a fairly reasonable starting point. Now we put a hole and let the hole propagate. And we see that as the hole propagates, something interesting happens. To begin with, all nearest neighbor correlations between spins were antiferromagnetic. But as the hole moves, you can see that it leaves behind a trail of flipped spins. So we actually get a sort of spin structure which now has a nearest neighbor ferromagnetic correlation, which of course is energetically unfavorable. So motivated by this idea, early on in the kind of even pre-high TC era, people like Daniel Chomsky and then later the sort of high TC era, Bob Laughlin and others, suggested that the way to think about this sort of dopants in magnetic mode insulators is to, by analogy with one-dimensional systems where we know that electron breaks into a spin-in and a Holland, but in this case, spin-in and a Holland, they do not separate, but they're bound by a string, and therefore we end up with a meson-like picture of where, as you remember, in QCD, a meson consists of two quarks which are confined by a linear potential. Okay, so now what do experiments tell us about such magnetic polarons? So these are results, again, from Munich. So what they have done was to put one in Dublin. Again, for the Fermi Hubbard model, it actually turns out that the argument is the same for a hole or for a Dublin. There is an exact symmetry. So this Dublin is free to move anywhere in the two-dimensional plane. But the question that we want to understand is how do magnetic correlations change in the vicinity of a Dublin, right? Because previously that we said what's happening, right? That actually every dopant becomes a magnetic polaron. And that's what was measured here. But the way it's presented is because they were interested in sort of the kind of this magnetic cloud around the dopant. That's why they always put a Dublin in the center of the image. And I emphasize this Dublin was free to be anywhere in this plane, but just for showing correlation, it's placed at the center, and then it's color coding of correlations. So notice that even though from color coding, it looks like it's a two-point spin correlation, but it's kind of at a certain distance away from the Dublin. Therefore, fundamentally, it is a three-point correlation function, which includes kind of one charge and two spin correlators, and two spin operators. And if we look at nearest neighbor correlations, what we see is that far away from the Dublin, okay, we get strong antiferromagnetic correlations, which are somewhat suppressed in the vicinity of a Dublin. And that, okay, is natural because, as we said, well, as a whole, while Dublin moves around, it reshuffles spins. But something even more dramatic happens when we look at diagonal correlations, right? So remember, in an antiferromagnetic state, diagonal correlation should be ferromagnetic. And indeed, far away from the Dublin, we see positive correlations, ferromagnetic. But around the Dublin, they even change sign, right? So the character of correlations changed. Qualitatively, it's easy to understand what's happening. So this was our hole, right? And so at this point, like all diagonal correlations are ferromagnetic, but as the hole moves, now you see that we actually get two, we get two of these diagonal pairs that have antiferromagnetic correlations. And in fact, they became diagonal, like especially this one, because it used to be nearest neighbor. And like at nearest neighbors is always stronger than sort of longer range correlations. And that's why, you know, when we average now over all kind of diagonal correlations, we see that the antiferromagnetic correlation, which came from the nearest neighbor sites, actually dominates. And that's how we get this sort of qualitative change of magnetic correlations. We can develop this picture of magnetic polarons even further. So like in the simplest model, we can assume that the spin is stable, only the Holland is moving because it moves with T, single particle hopping, rather than exchange, which is slower for the spin-on. But then what we have to remember is that when we want to represent the motion of the Holland, it's not enough to characterize a transient state by instantaneous position of the hole. We should also specify the entire trajectory because this trajectory reflects the pattern of flipped spins. And that's why even when we set up like some kind of effective tight binding model, it's a tight binding on this beta lattice, and every side of this lattice actually corresponds to a different trajectory. But once we set up this beta lattice, it's rather simple to think about it as a tight binding model in the presence of the linear potential, where the linear potential is just given by the kind of exchange correlations. And one can use this, and as of course, like as the hole spreads out, as we said, it reshuffles the spins, and we can convert our knowledge of the wave function on this beta lattice into how much spin correlations would be affected, and we can use this, let's say, to compute, let's say, this nearest neighbor spin correlations, like this is comparison to experimental data, or let's say these are diagonal correlations, again, in this experiment, and you can see, and horizontal axis is the distance to the Dublin, right? Remember, we talked about near the Dublin, there is a change of sign, right? And that's what comes out from this effective beta lattice calculation. And then our experimental friends became more ambitious. So this is really the work of Christy Chu from Marcus Greiner's group together with Annabelle. And they asked a question whether one can identify the strings in the data directly, right? Remember we talked about like as a whole moves, it leaves behind the string of flipped spins. And in actually Marcus's data sort of system at that point, they could not sort of resolve both spin up and spin down. They had the coldest temperatures, but unfortunately they had to choose whether the image, let's say, spin up or spin down. So, but as you'll see, it's not a kind of a showstopper. So here, let's say they chose to look at the blue fermions, like spin up fermions. So then they just, they take an image and they see where all these spin up fermions are. And then they compare it to the best checkerboard pattern. And they mark the difference. And you see, so here you have 4 sites which differ between what they measured and the perfect checkerboard. Here there are these 2 sides, So let's call them strings. Now this is strings of length 4. These are 2 strings of length 2. And then there is a kind of string of length 1. And then one can make a histogram. And then one can plot the probability, right, to find strings of different lengths as a function of the length. So the slower dots, they correspond to the kind of this probability already at half fillings, so without any holes doped. And so that's our kind of background noise. And the reason why we have strings, well, because it's a quantum antiferromagnet, right? It's not a classical antiferromagnet, which which is shown schematically here. It has a lot of fluctuations, both quantum and thermal. And what we're interested in is the extra signal, kind of extra strings, which are induced by adding holes. And okay, it doesn't, like, so these are the upper points, and it may not look like a strong signal, okay, but if you look more carefully, notice that the vertical axis is a log scale. Therefore, for longer strings, the probability goes up by almost a factor of 10. So therefore, it's like a dramatic increase in longer strings induced by the holes. Okay, of course, the kind of a bigger question is, so can we understand something about the phase diagram? And in particular, can we go beyond understanding a single polaron to saying something about the phase diagram of cuprates? And so this is, I will start by sort of reminding you of recent work in the cuprates community, where they identified an interesting transition, like which is temperature independent. So I will not go into details, but roughly you can say that for stronger doping, right, let's say here, the system looks more like a conventional Fermi liquid. So for example, when they try to look at quasi-particle weight, how well would the electrons look like kind of quasi-particles in a conventional weakly interacting Fermi gas? Yeah, this weight goes up, which is what you expect in the Fermi liquid state. But in the underdoped regime, it actually the quasi-particle weight is being suppressed as we lower the temperature. And so this is just one of the indications. There are many other types of measurements which suggest this sort of crossover as a function of doping. So the question is, where does it come from? So I'll show you just some of the insight that sort of came out from recent experiments by the Munich group. So what they're measuring here, these are like 2-point correlation function, right? So, but let us just focus on correlation function, which at half filling in the sort of more insulating phase corresponds to ferromagnetic correlations, like here, this diagonal. And so here we see these correlations as a function of doping. And you see, like, this is 0 doping, they're ferromagnetic. But then as we increase doping, they change sign. That's what we discussed before. And then we can take another type of correlation. So this is now in the horizontal direction, but so again, separated by 2 sides. So again, they're ferromagnetic at half filling. But then as doping increases, these correlations sort of go from ferromagnetic to antiferromagnetic. We go to even longer sort of side separation. And again, we see a change of sign, all happening around the doping of 30%. And then if we look at what we can convert real space correlation function to momentum space correlation function, which is what we're used to for measurements used in neutron scattering, you see that at half filling, that's our familiar peak at pi, that's antiferromagnetism. And then this commensurate nature of the peak remains until about the same 30%, and only above 30%, this peak splits into 4 incommensurate. And like these 4 peaks is what you would expect from a simple kind of like Linhart type function or even RPA. So clearly something is happening that at below 30%, the system is more reminiscent of this picture of magnetic polarons, whereas above 30% doping, it looks more like what we would expect by doing perturbative calculations. So again, like for example, the change of sign, like in, yes?
How do these parameters like T, J, U,
They chose them to be like U of the order of 8T, just sort of to similar to cuprates. The questions? Right, so and actually like a simple, I should have said it earlier, like, so how do we think about the correlations becoming anti-ferromagnetic at ladde doping? Well, that's what we remember in Fermi liquids, right? So there's a Pauli principle, so we're less likely to find fermions with the same spin close to each other than to fermions with the opposite spin. And so we see that at ladde doping, we're really sort of just getting all the correlations becoming predominantly anti-ferromagnetic. So, okay, sorry, and one can sort of then even try to do comparison between like sort of RPA or like some sort of more elaborate versions of RPA. And again, what one finds is that they work up to about 30%, but then they fail at smaller fillings. Sorry, at smaller dopings, which suggests that, again, like perturbative treatment, what we learn in our many-body classes applies at larger doping factors, above 30%, but at smaller dopings, we sort of actually get better description of the data by using the picture of the geometrical picture of mesons as, so of magnetic polarons as mesons, which consist of, bound, spinning, and hollow. Okay. And then you can ask, okay, can we see pairing? And probably all of you are aware that so far the biggest challenge for experiments with cold atoms has been temperature, right? If we just estimate what temperature is needed to achieve the analog of D-wave pairing is quite lower than what's currently accessible in experiments. However, the first observation of magnetically mediated pairing in the Fermi Hubbard type model has already been done. And that's what I'll tell you. And the idea for this type of enhancing magnetic pairing really goes to Annabelle and Fabian, and then experiments were done in Munich. So let us consider like a ladder, like a simple system, and ask, okay, so what do we expect for the type of, let's say, correlations, just for spins, or let's say when we start doping it. So like a good caricature of, let's say, an doped system is when spins would make singlets on the rungs, right? And then there is, like once we start doping these ladders, the expectation is that, oh, we will place 2 holes on the same rung, so that this will cause kind of the least disruption of this kind of spin gap phase. Actually, I think Matthew has a beautiful review paper on this, on ladders. Probably one of the first places where I learned about it. But if you think about the system, you realize that life is not so simple. So in particular, if we think about single particle tunneling, having 2 holes on the same rung is bad because then holes cannot lower their kinetic energy. Because whereas if they are away from each other, well, they can sort of tunnel freely on their rungs, and that actually becomes favorable. So if we want to enhance pairing, what we would like to do is actually suppress single particle tunneling and enhance exchange interaction between the rungs. But of course, like our condensement intuition says, well, it's impossible, right? Like sort of exchange is just T squared. But so here the idea of Annabelle and Fabian was to use the mixed dimensional system. Imagine that we just bias, right? We introduce a potential difference between the 2 chains. Then what will happen if this difference is sufficiently strong, single particle tunneling is suppressed. On the other hand, exchange gets larger because now when this fermion from the left chain goes to the right chain, you see that the double occupied site does not just cost energy U, but it costs energy U minus delta, where delta is biased. So Therefore, this seemingly kind of contradictory idea of enhancing sort of exchange while suppressing single particle tunneling is not so ridiculous. And I think Gil had sort of related ideas for using it with light, but in this case, it's just done by sort of engineering the system. So, okay, this just shows the result of experiments. So what you can see is, again, an image, and okay, it's not spin resolved, but so you can clearly see that here 2 holes are on the same rung, and you can say, oh, maybe it's like specially tailored image. The answer is no. So to make it quantitative, what you can see here is a correlation function of holes as a function of separation between them. Yeah. And you can see that if we just take plain vanilla sort of ladder, then to find 2 holes on the same rung is actually unlikely. You see that there is a kind of clear sort of negative correlations. But then when they introduce this bias equal to half of u, we have a strongly enhanced probability to find 2 holes on the same side. So, you know, this actually, it's interesting that if we go back to older papers, like people like Schultz or Heinz Schultz or Morris Rice, they were often using this kind of toy model where you have strong interchain exchange interaction and no single particle tunneling. But thinking about it all is just like a way to understand the kind of the limits, but it's like a Gedanken model. But in this case, it has been realized experimentally. I think this clearly demonstrates that this binding of holes arises from now magnetic exchange interactions. Okay, but so far, I guess at least one of the aspects of simulations that I showed was that they were relevant to kind of physics questions. And what would be useful is to extend ideas of quantum simulations to what can benefit kind of, I don't know, society in a broader sense. And so the question that I'm sure many of us are thinking about is how to take currently available NISQ technology which has a limited number of qubits, which has noise, and make something something practically useful. And there was an interesting comment by John Praskill, who said that he expected the kind of first and most relevant applications of NISQ devices will be to solve problems which are intrinsically quantum. I don't know if some of you may know that there is this Twitter, which is quantum bullshit detector, which sort of rates different statements about quantum computing as bullshit and non-bullshit. So this was classified as a non-bullshit. So I don't know. So anyway, so like I will try to suggest to you one of the problems that we have been thinking about recently. The problem was actually brought to us by our colleagues from Harvard Medical School. And they told us that in biomedical sciences, there is actually an interesting challenge that, okay, NMR is one of the most powerful techniques, so you can do it like sort of inside the human body. It doesn't require, say, you know, like taking liquids out, putting them through complicated machines. But the challenge is, like when you read, you measure the spectrum, how to relate it to the actual molecule. And in fact, as kind of a first step, they said it would be useful if from the spectrum, we could tell something about the underlying Hamiltonian. And so it's kind of, I think Victor was telling us a problem of how to hear the shape of the drum. It's kind of a problem in this family, right? So we hear, meaning we measure the spectrum of the system, and we want to understand what is the underlying quantum systems. Well, one big difference is that it's a very nonlinear system. So whereas like the problem of a membrane was underdefined, you could not recover the shape. In this case, it's actually overdefined, and the simple way to understand it is that the number of sort of transitions that we have is sort of exponential in the number of spins, whereas the number of interactions is just polynomial. But what is unusual about analyzing sort of spin correlation function that enters, that's relevant for NMR is that it's computed at infinite temperature. And the reason is that like measurements are usually done at room temperature, and so it's orders of magnitude larger than a typical scale of, let's say, interaction of the spins or the so-called or like chemical shifts, like Zeeman splitting. So anyway, so okay, since I don't have much time, I'll just sort of give you the gist of the idea. So why is it hard to, let's say, do this using sort of conventional approaches? Because the way you do it, you make a guess about the Hamiltonian, and then you compute the kind of NMR spectrum, and you compare it to what has been measured. And of course, like usually, it does not agree, so you have to make some adjustment to the Hamiltonian, compute the spectrum again, and you just keep doing this until it converges. But computation of the spectrum just from the Hamiltonian, if you do it kind of in the most direct way without making any assumptions about the Hamiltonian, requires diagonalizing like a system in the Hilbert space, which has dimension of Hilbert space, right? So it's exponentially hard. On the other hand, you can show that you can come up with a sort of quantum algorithm which computes the spectrum in sort of which basically scales as n squared. Again, it's because it's very natural. We're just using sort of a quantum machine to compute a spectrum obtained from another quantum system. And then, of course, okay, the interesting questions about optimization landscape. So can you really, let's say, if you compute let's say, a trial spectrum, will you be able to converge to the one that you want? It's especially tricky because like the spectrum has many sharp peaks. So you can imagine if you sort of like in the search for the Hamiltonian, you can be stuck. You just fit one of the sharp features. It may be difficult to be unstuck. So what actually like a brilliant idea by Dries was to say, well, actually, let us first start by analyzing spectra of molecules which are actually relevant for biomedical sciences. And so this is a simple example of just 4-spin molecules. And you see that they cluster in a very natural way. And you can see that within this cluster, the character of the spectra is quite different. So for example, in this case, you see, well, we have many kind of degenerate peaks, which suggest some high symmetry. And indeed, so basically all molecules in this cluster, they have this methyl group, right, where all these hydrogens are equivalent. Or if we look at this spectrum, which looks the most what we would expect like a spin chain spectrum to resemble, they all have this benzene ring type part. So anyway, so the idea, it turns out that, yes, what you have to do before you start doing optimization, like you should know about the clusters, and when you sort of get a new spectrum, you should start in the vicinity, basically in sort of, let's say, the central, like the average Hamiltonian parameters of the appropriate cluster, then you can converge. So another insight of Dries was to recognize that spectral functions are kind of like probability distributions in statistics, right? They're normalized, they're positive definite, and therefore one can come up with variation of Bayesian approach, which allows, after we do a measurement like of the spectrum with some sort of guessed parameters, to improve our knowledge, our guesses about what parameters of the Hamiltonian are. So again, in this toy example of, well, not toy, it's actually, so the spectra that Dries really worked out, they are actual molecules, like which you can get from database of biomedical research. So in this case, you can converge of the order of 50 or 60 iterations. But of course, the challenging part was sort of going beyond, just doing like simulations entirely on the classical computers and doing something on a quantum hardware. This is where the beautiful work by Crystal and collaborators came in. So this was a simulation of the spectrum of acetonide. So again, we're dealing with a 4-spin system. And what is tricky, so there are several things which sort of is challenging. So first of all, that what we're trying to do is to implement this evolution, right, with a Hamiltonian, which is SU2 symmetric, whereas native gates for ions are obviously not SU2 symmetric, so we have to trotterize. And in fact, also you see that the spectrum consists of sharp peaks, so which naively suggests, oh, we would have to go to very long times just in order to get resolution, and that would require many measurements. So here, that's where sort of like considerable work had to be done by Crystal, Kushal, and Dries on sort of finding the right approach which allow to kind of minimize the number of time measurements as the number of time steps that one does in the calculation so that one can actually get a spectrum. So what you see here is really comparison of the spectrum experimentally measured by Dima Butker's group on this acetonide, acetonitrile molecule with the kind of results obtained on the sort of quantum hardware. One interesting feature is that like if we look at simulations on a quantum computer, generally it's quite good, but one big distinction is that there is an extra peak at frequency of J/2, and that is probably kind of will be an interesting common feature of many other simulations, that if we look at this molecule, it has this symmetry, like these three spins coming in a very symmetric way. And therefore, even though there are energy splittings which equal to J/2, but matrix elements just vanish, right, because of underlying symmetries. But so even when we implement this Hamiltonian in a quantum computer, even though the Hamiltonian still has this symmetry, but obviously noise doesn't. And just it's because of the noise which break this symmetry, we get an extra peak. Okay, so right, and like actually doing this calculation, even though it's a simple system, was kind of instructive, because now we can use this result to try and ask a question. So when will this type of approach become competitive or useful for actual calculations? So the estimate that Kushal and Dries did was to take molecules, known molecules, which are hard for currently known approaches, which require sort of considerable kind of classical computational time. And then we can ask, so what is the effort involved? Like, what would we need about quantum hardware to achieve this? And it turns out that this effort will depend on the fidelity of the gates. And the way to understand this is as follows. Okay, remember, like we said, we're trying to implement continuous time evolution, but we're doing it using discrete gates. And so naively, you would like to make as many discrete steps as possible to minimize the sort of trotterization errors, the fact that we discretize. But on the other hand, if we discretize too much, we know that every operation has a hardware error. Therefore, we'll start being penalized just because we're trying to make too many operations. And therefore, so you can see that like two pieces compete. So let's say, depending on the fidelity, we want to make the number of steps, the number of gates to be maximum. But because of, so in this case, so we want to make this step as small as possible for trotterization, but in order to minimize kind of the error due to infidelity, we want to make the number of gates as small as possible. And then we have to find a compromise. And what is special about this NMR is a sort of simulation of NMR is that it's not like a classical optimization algorithm. We don't have to be kind of precise. We only have to compute the spectra as well as the intrinsic width, right? Remember, I showed you this, let's say, spectra. So this is the actual experimentally measured spectra. They have an intrinsic width. So when you do a quantum simulation, you don't need to do better than this intrinsic width. And therefore, you can then actually find, like for a given infidelity, you can then optimize, you can find the number of gates that you want to do that sort of optimizes the accuracy of your calculation, and then you can compare to what is the kind of decoherence rate of the molecules which are relevant. And to make a long story short, we find that when the infidelity becomes of the order of 10 to minus 4, and when the number of circuits becomes of the order of 100,000, this method should be able to do calculations that are currently hard for classical algorithms. Of course, like this number appears very often in the context of error correction, but what I want to stress is that when the system becomes this good, we will not need to do error correction. We can just start solving problem directly, because at this point, the accuracy of this quantum simulation becomes as good as we sort of ultimately need, because nature is kind, it has its finite decoherence rate of its own. Okay, so with this, let me conclude. I try to give you examples of quantum simulations addressing different problems on different sort of platforms, from quantum dots to cold atoms to kind of quantum computers based on ion chains. Thank you.